My son made me leave for his in-laws. Within an hour, they demanded a divorce from her. The midday sun over the Carolina coast did not simply shine. It pressed down like a hand, flattening sound and thought until only the essentials remained. Hot stone under bare feet, the taste of salt on the tongue, and the shrill chant of cicadas vibrating in the live oaks. From the terrace of Indigo Point, the heat looked soft and golden, like a veil against the horizon. Inside the house, however, the warmth felt dense and suffocating, as if even the air knew whose presence ruled the space. Hit that subscribe button and tap the bell icon so you never miss our latest uploads. Julia Thorne stood at the kitchen island, a knife in her steady hand, slicing through a ripe watermelon. The blade moved with practiced ease, parting the thick rind, sliding into the ruby heart of the fruit with a crisp, damp crack. Juice beaded on the cutting board like scattered rubies. She arranged each wedge carefully on a platter. It was a gesture she had performed 1,000 times before, cutting fruit for guests, for family, for the son she had once cradled in arms that smelled of sawdust and sea breeze. Today it felt like she was performing it for strangers. 20 years earlier, Julia had sat at this same island with rolled-up blueprints and a pencil smudging her fingers, arguing with contractors about angles and window placement, fighting the zoning committee over setbacks and utilities. Back then, the house had been a dream in graphite lines, a stubborn idea in an overworked architect's mind. She had chosen the southwest-facing kitchen window, so the last light of day would spill across the counters and not blind anyone making breakfast. She had fought for these Italian tiles, a warm cream the color of baked milk, when everyone told her to choose something cheaper, something easier to replace. Every inch of Indigo Point carried the weight of her choices, her compromises, her victories. Now, as laughter floated in from the terrace, Julia felt like a guest worker in a hotel she could no longer afford, a ghost in her own blueprint. On the terrace, under a pergola draped in wisteria, sat the people who seemed to believe they owned the world. Her son, Mark, hunched over his plate at the far end of the table, shoulders rounded, gaze fixed on his food with a concentration that told Julia exactly what he was doing, hiding in plain sight. He had used that same posture when he was 8 and had broken the neighbor's window with a baseball, expecting punishment yet hoping to vanish. Opposite him lounged Victor and Eleanor Vale, her daughter-in-law's parents. They wore the casual arrogance of people who had grown used to being served. Victor's phone lay beside his plate, screen lighting his ruddy face as he scrolled between bites. Eleanor's wrists and neck flashed with bracelets and layered gold, heavy pieces that belonged at some gala, not at a relaxed beach lunch. She picked at the red snapper Julia had grilled that morning, her expression suggesting that merely chewing the food was an act of generosity. Beside them, at the head of the table where Julia usually sat, reigned Karina, Mark's wife, the valet's only daughter. She was radiant in a loose white dress that set off her deep, luminous skin and framed her like a queen presiding over conquered territory. She poured chilled wine into crystal glasses as though she possessed the vines that had produced the grapes. Her smile was bright, her eyes sharp, her tone always just a fraction louder than necessary, so that every sentence claimed space. As Julia crossed the threshold with a platter of watermelon, Karina's voice rang out, light and commanding. She was talking about the house as though Julia were not standing there, as though the owner's presence were a minor inconvenience, like a squeaky hinge to be replaced later. Karina's wineglass made a lazy circle in the air, aimed toward the garden. She chirped about tearing down that useless wall, about replacing the handcrafted plaster Julia had chosen with a seamless expanse of glass to modernize the view. She gestured toward the rose beds, the ones Julia had planned with obsessive care to withstand salty winds and sandy soil, dismissing them as fussy, outdated, old lady touches that would soon be eradicated and replaced by neat, sterile strips of manicured lawn. Mark mumbled agreement, his yes, whatever you think is best, sliding out of him like water over stone. Victor nodded occasionally, Eleanor sniffed, and all of them spoke about demolishing Julia's work in the same tone one might use to discuss rearranging furniture in a rental. The cold knot that had been forming somewhere beneath Julia's ribs tightened another notch. They were rearranging her life out loud, in front of her, and they did not even bother to pretend she mattered. She set the platter on the table without a word. Karina reached for a slice of watermelon, took a delicate bite, and then snapped her fingers without looking at Julia, the sound sharp as a whip crack. "We're out of wine, Julia. Bring another bottle from the fridge, would you? And more ice. This is melted." Victor and Eleanor exchanged a small, satisfied look, the kind of private smirk that said they believed the world naturally divided into those who poured and those who drank, those who labored and those who enjoyed. Julia felt the invisible string inside her stretch tighter. For the sake of peace, for the sake of some lingering loyalty to the frightened little boy who now sat as a grown man, pretending she didn't exist, she forced her voice to remain even. She murmured that she would bring more wine, picked up the empty bottle, and walked back inside. In the brief cool of the hallway, with the hum of the air conditioning whispering against her skin, she let her forehead rest against the painted wall. It was solid under her brow, as solid as the foundation she had fought to pour when the city insisted on cutting corners. Her heart thudded hard enough that she could hear the pulse in her ears. For a moment she thought only of endurance, concrete that held against storms, walls that did not collapse despite years of pressure. She whispered to herself that she could withstand one more week. She had survived collapses far worse. Divorce, a recession that had wiped out long-term projects, nights of unpaid bills, and stubborn hope. She could survive a few days of rudeness. When she returned to the terrace with a chilled bottle in hand, Eleanor regarded her with a mild curiosity reserved for something exotic but entirely unimportant. Eleanor asked if Julia really did all the housework herself, as though Julia were a vaguely amusing hobbyist, a retiree with too much time. She mentioned their housekeeper at home, their caterer, their lawn service, painting a picture of a world in which people like Julia existed only to polish the floors and refill glasses. Julia poured the wine, staying silent. The invisible string inside pulled almost to breaking. Something inside her finally rebelled. She announced, almost lightly, that she needed to run to the market. They were out of figs, and she thought the valets might enjoy figs with cheese later. Karina, without looking up, told her to pick up better olives this time, not the cheap kind, and waved a hand as though dismissing a servant. Julia slipped through the gate with her bag still slung over her shoulder. She walked down the sandy road toward town without changing shoes or clothes, letting the white heat sting her eyes. The cicadas in the oak screamed. The smell of frying shrimp drifted from roadside shacks, mixed with diesel fumes and seaweed. The small coastal market was alive with noise, customers haggling, vendors calling out deals, tourists laughing too loudly at nothing. Among piles of peaches and baskets of herbs, Julia found the figs. Their dark skins split with ripeness, revealing a sticky sweetness beneath. Habit made her reach for the most perfect ones, fingers gentle, mind already turning toward how she would arrange them on a plate, how she would place them where Karina liked to sit, because even now some maternal instinct pushed her to care for those who had made her feel invisible. That was when her phone buzzed in the pocket of her linen dress. She wiped her fingers on a napkin, pulled out the phone, and saw Mark's name on the screen. Hope rose unexpectedly, a small, fragile thing. Perhaps he had found the courage to push back. Perhaps he wanted to apologize. She opened the message. The words blurred for a second in the sunlight, but their meaning struck clear as a hammer on glass. Mark wrote that he understood it was her beach house, but that Karina's parents felt uncomfortable with her around. He and Karina wanted privacy with them to discuss family matters. He asked her to check into a hotel for the rest of the week, adding that they would gladly cover the cost. She read it twice, then a third time. The tears she had been swallowing all morning dried in an instant. She stood in the middle of the busy market as people brushed past her with baskets and bags, and gradually the noise faded into a dull roar, like the sea in a storm heard through thick walls. Her own son, standing on a terrace she had designed, in a house she had fought to build, had written to her as if she were an inconvenient tenant. They would pay for the room, he'd said, as though that somehow transformed the insult into generosity. The indignity of it might have broken her if something else had not stepped in first. A clarity colder and sharper than anger slid into place. Years of training as an architect had left her with a habit. When confronted with cracks, she did not collapse. She traced them back to their origin. She saw, suddenly, the pattern she had refused to acknowledge. Every subtle insult, every demand disguised as a favor, every assumption that her resources, her money, her home, her time, could be rearranged according to others' comfort. The structure had been failing for years. Today it finally fell. She typed one word in response. She wrote that she understood. Then she hit send, feeling nothing but a strange, electric calm. She didn't open a hotel app. Instead, she scrolled through her contacts until she found a name she hadn't touched in 3 years. Damian Pike, luxury realtor. The man who had once said, half joking, that if she ever wanted to sell Indigo Point, he knew a list of people who'd line up to pay cash for the view. One call later, standing between crates of figs she would no longer buy, Julia lifted the phone to her ear and, with a voice as steady as if she were ordering new flooring, told him she wanted to sell the house immediately. Damian's office stood on the waterfront behind gleaming glass. It looked out over the marina, where white boats bobbed in the sun like lazy seabirds. Julia stepped into the cool interior, still smelling faintly of the market. Salt, fruit, sun. The air conditioning hit her arms and raised goosebumps. Damian rose from behind his desk, surprise flickering across his face before his professional smile locked into place. He remembered her. He had been there when she fought through permits and inspections, when she stood before a city committee explaining why a cantilevered terrace would not, in fact, collapse into the waves. They had shared coffee during that exhausting year when Indigo Point was still only a steel skeleton perched above the dunes. He asked if she was serious. The question carried worry, not doubt. She moved to the chair opposite his desk and sat with her back straight and hands folded over her bag. She told him she wanted a buyer not soon, not this month, but that day. She knew her title was clear. No mortgage, no co-owners, no messy entanglements. Every bill paid, every line item clean. She'd built this house as her fortress and never allowed any financial crack to threaten it. Damian pushed back in his chair, studying her face, looking for signs of impulsive madness. All he found was a cold, engineer-like focus. He hesitated only a moment before his years of experience in high-end real estate kicked in. He spoke of a developer from Atlanta, Titus Banks, who had been circling this region for months. Titus liked to buy properties already built but underused, and he liked them dramatically. Cliffs, views, odd angles. He had seen Indigo Point from the water once, and reportedly called it $1 million view wrapped in someone else's memories. He was in town now, looking for something turnkey. Julia asked if Titus worked with cash. Damian said he did. She pulled a scrap of notepaper toward her and wrote down the price. High enough to secure comfort for the rest of her life, but not so high as to chase away a man known for preferring speed over haggling. Damian's eyebrows rose when he saw the number. It was ambitious, but the view justified most of it. He called Titus on speaker. The developer's voice came through the line low and amused, full of the careless confidence of self-made money. When Damian mentioned Indigo Point, there was an immediate, sharp interest. Titus said he would take it sight unseen if the condition of the house matched what Damian had described years ago. Julia listened as Damian quoted her price. There was a short silence, then a rumbling laugh and a demand for directions. Titus said he would be at the gates in 40 minutes. Damian ended the call, still watching Julia with a kind of awe. He printed a brief letter of intent, slid it across the desk, and placed a pen beside it. These were not the final transfer papers. Those would come with the bank, but they were enough to set in motion a machine that would be difficult to stop once it started. Julia did not hesitate. Signing her name made something inside her loosen. Each stroke of the pen felt like severing an invisible rope that had been pulling her backward for years. She had given, forgiven, accommodated, and bent herself into shapes to fit into other people's comfort zones. With that single signature, she took control back in the one language everyone in that terrace understood: ownership. Damien promised to drive over immediately to meet Titus at the gate. He would bring the documents and coordinate bank transfers. Julia rose to leave, but at the door she paused, catching her reflection in the dark glass. A woman in a plain sundress with her hair pulled into a careless knot, an older face marked by fatigue more than wrinkles. She saw no victim there. She saw the architect who had once defended impossible projects in front of hostile committees, scarf knotted at her throat like armor. On impulse, she stepped out and turned not toward the parking lot, but toward the boutique next door. Inside, soft lighting glowed on silk and leather. It was the same shop where Karina would occasionally drag her parents to browse, then leave, complaining about overpriced labels. Julia walked directly to the accessories. She chose a narrow silk scarf in deep green embroidered with threads of gold. It reminded her of the vines that curled up the pergola at home. She tied it around her neck in the practiced knot she had used as a young architect when she needed to cloak nerves with style. At the sunglasses display, she picked a pair of large frames that covered her tired eyes and transformed her expression into something more enigmatic. When she looked at herself again, the shift was subtle but real. The scarf and glasses did not make her younger or more glamorous. They made her recognizably herself, the woman who did not apologize for taking up space in her own life. On the way back to the waterfront, she ducked into a cafe, ordered a sharp espresso, and settled at a table with a view of the harbor's small clock tower. Her phone rested on the table beside the coffee. She had half an hour before she needed to be at the house. That was enough time to make one more quiet adjustment. She opened her banking app and pulled up her recent deposits and transfers. For the past 3 years, her income had been straightforward. Pension payments, small consulting fees from occasional design work, no external transfers from family. This was important, to show that no one had been supporting her, despite the story Karina liked to tell. Then she opened the digital folder where she kept scans of important documents. The deed to Indigo Point with its date nearly 2 decades old, city permits, tax assessments. She created a new, password-protected archive and dropped the deed into it. After a moment's thought, she added another file, a bank statement she had obtained weeks earlier using a favor from an old acquaintance in finance, a document she hadn't yet decided how to use. At the time, she had requested that statement out of an uneasy suspicion. Karina had thrown around too many unsecured credit cards and too many casual comments about house payments that didn't add up. Julia had told herself she was being paranoid. Now she knew better. The second document traced 3 years of deposits into an account in Karina's name. It showed a steady stream of transfers from an account belonging to Victor and Eleanor, each labeled mortgage support or house loan help. There was no corresponding outflow to any bank holding a mortgage on Indigo Point because there was no mortgage. The money went instead to boutiques, travel agencies, spas, and to a personal trainer in a nearby city, a man whose name appeared repeatedly alongside notes like supplements and sessions. Julia attached the locked archive to a message and sent it to both Victor's and Eleanor's numbers with a simple note, a small gift for the family. She told them she would give them the password when they met later. The double check marks appeared instantly. She imagined them on the terrace, their phones pinging at the same time. Perhaps Eleanor would smile, thinking it was photos of their grandchildren that did not exist. Perhaps Victor would ignore it. Either way, the hook was set. Curiosity, once sharpened, rarely dulled. Her coffee finished, she stepped outside. A call from Damien buzzed through. He said Titus was nearly at the house. They would arrive only minutes behind her. Julia pocketed her phone, hailed a cab, and watched the town slide past the window as they drove toward Indigo Point. Pine trees rose like dark pillars, the ocean flashing silver between them. Each turn of the road brought her closer to the stage where she would sever the last ties to an arrangement that had quietly been killing her. The taxi stopped at the familiar wrought iron gate. From where she stood, she could see a hulking black SUV parked behind Damien's sedan. A large man in a linen suit paced near the fence with his phone pressed to his ear. His presence felt like a hammer next to a fine crystal. Dangerous, decisive, impossible to ignore. Damien waved when he saw her, a bit pale but excited. Titus ended his call and turned to look at Julia from behind his expensive sunglasses. His gaze traveled from her sandals to the scarf at her throat and back to her face, assessing not her outfit but the set of her shoulders. Julia greeted them calmly and apologized for any delay. Titus responded with a gruff compliment about her punctuality, then made a joke about Damien having undersold her. He said he had expected a sweet, dithering old lady, not someone who looked as though she had come to negotiate a hostile takeover. Julia unlocked the gate and warned them that there were people inside who believed the house, in some sense, belonged to them. She called them temporary tenants. She explained that they did not yet know she intended to sell and asked Titus to play a role, that of the uncompromising new owner ready to claim what was his. Something in the scenario clearly delighted him. His grin widened, exposing a flash of predatory amusement. Evicting uninvited guests suited his taste for drama. He agreed readily, slipping his phone into his pocket and following her up the path like a general about to storm a small, poorly defended fort. The sound of laughter drifted from the terrace, the clinking of cutlery, the easy rise and fall of self-satisfied voices. They had no idea the foundation under their assumed privilege had just been sold out from beneath them. Julia climbed the steps, opened the terrace doors, and walked inside. Conversation died mid-sentence. The air seemed to thicken, stunned into silence. Her son stared at her, wineglass halfway to his lips. Karina, perched half on his lap, slid off and straightened her dress, her smile flickering with annoyance more than surprise. Victor and Eleanor stared as though they had been interrupted by an unwelcome performer at their private show. Julia, flanked by Damien and Titus, walked forward. She did not shrink or apologize. She removed her sunglasses slowly and let her gaze rest on each of them in turn, feeling, for the first time in a long while, not like a servant returning to a table, but like a landlord inspecting a property. This time, she had not come to pour drinks. She had come to end an illusion. What followed played out like a carefully blocked scene, but Julia had not scripted it. She merely followed the lines that presented themselves, one by one. Karina recovered first. Her smile slid back into place, saccharine and brittle. She approached Julia with small, rehearsed steps, her heels clicking faintly on the stone. She spoke in the tone one uses for a stubborn relative who refuses to follow instructions. She reminded Julia of their agreement, that Julia would leave them alone with Karina's parents and enjoy a hotel stay, that they had already sent her taxi money. As she spoke, she reached for her purse and began digging inside, clearly intending to produce a few bills as a tip, as if Julia were a maid who had lingered too long after a shift. Victor chuckled without rising, gesturing vaguely toward Titus and Damien. He asked if they were porters sent to help Julia with her luggage, or perhaps, he smirked, friends from the senior center. Eleanor giggled behind her napkin. Mark said nothing. His fingers tightened around the stem of his glass. When he finally spoke, his words were barely audible. He asked his mother not to make a scene. He asked her to leave. Julia did not look at him. She stepped around Karina's outstretched hand, around the crumpled bill she tried to press into Julia's palm, and addressed Titus instead. She spoke of the living room's light, of the way it shifted at different hours of the day, of the structural integrity of the walls. Titus, catching on immediately, stepped into the role of buyer with almost theatrical gusto. He walked across the room and knocked on surfaces, made approving noises at the thickness of the support columns, and commented loudly on the excellent bones. Karina's composure cracked. She demanded to know who he was, what he was doing, how he dared walk through their house as if he owned the place. Her father erupted, puffing himself up, declaring that this was his daughter's home and that they would call security. Julia moved calmly to the coffee table and placed a folder, Damien's folder, where everyone could see it. Inside, on top, lay the deed to Indigo Point. She opened it and slid it toward Victor. He resisted at first, waving it off, but there was an edge in her voice when she suggested he read it, a tone he recognized from boardrooms and negotiations. He picked up the deed and, with a small frown, slipped on his glasses. The seconds stretched as he scanned the lines. His posture changed almost imperceptibly, shoulders straightening, jaw tightening. He read the owner's name aloud, Julia Thorne. He read the dates. He read the term sole owner. He looked up at his daughter, then down at the paper again, as if hoping the letters would rearrange themselves into a more convenient reality. Karina launched into a breathless explanation before anyone could speak. It was a technicality, she insisted. Julia's name was on the deed only for tax reasons. She said she and Mark paid the mortgage, her parents helped when they could, that everyone knew how these things worked. Titus laughed, low and unpleasant, and mentioned offhand that he had already seen the title report. No mortgage, no lien, no second owner. He had agreed to a cash purchase because the house was clean. There was no bank anywhere with a claim on Indigo Point. The truth hung in the air, undeniable and heavy. Victor's face darkened from pink to a mottled, dangerous red. His voice dropped to the tone of a man used to demanding answers and getting them. He asked Karina to explain, slowly, why he had been making monthly transfers labeled mortgage support if there was no mortgage. 36 months, $5,000 each time, $180,000. Where had the money gone? Karina tried to pivot. Renovations, she said. Upgrades. She gestured vaguely at the walls, at the windows, at the invisible plumbing beneath their feet. She spoke of roofs and pipes and finishes as if the words themselves might conjure proof. Julia let herself smile just slightly. She traced a fingertip along the wall, naming the year the plaster had been applied and the crew she had hired. She pointed at the tiles, at the windows, at every detail that predated Karina's marriage to her son. No renovations had been done in the last 3 years. Nothing Karina claimed to have paid for existed. The lie fell apart. Eleanor stared at her daughter with dawning horror. Victor's anger shifted from generalized outrage to something more focused, more lethal. He was not a gentle man, but he was not stupid. The evidence was stark. His money had not gone to a bank. It had gone to fund his daughter's lifestyle while she occupied another woman's house. Mark shifted uncomfortably, muttering that he had not known about any mortgage support, that he had believed his wife's story about occasional help with groceries. His voice cracked under the weight of his own willful ignorance. Titus, checking his watch, interrupted the unfolding family drama with a comment about needing an answer. Was the sale going forward or not? He had no time, he said, for melodrama unless it came with a closing date. Julia seized the opening. She announced, clearly, that the house was sold and that the current occupants had an hour to pack their belongings and leave before she handed over the keys. The money, she added, had already been wired. Karina shrieked that Julia could not do this. She claimed the house was Mark's inheritance, that Julia had a moral, if not legal, obligation to leave it to him. She cried that she had invested too much of her life there to be thrown out like a trespasser. Julia answered that her obligation had ended the day Mark became an adult. She had raised him, housed him, educated him. She was not required to fund his cowardice or his wife's greed. Indigo Point, she said, had always been her pension plan. She had simply decided to cash it out early. Damien produced the contract. Titus signed with a flourish. Julia's phone pinged moments later with a notification. An amount large enough to rewrite her future had landed in her account. The legalities finished. The emotional consequences crashed in. Victor turned on his daughter with a fury that made even Titus, no stranger to harsh exchanges, fall silent. In front of everyone, he called what she had done by its proper name: theft. Eleanor, shaken to the core, clung to his arm, asking how their own child could have used them so callously. Karina's desperation reached its peak. Faced with losing the house, the money stream, and her parents' financial support, she grasped for one last weapon: pity. She straightened, wiped at her destroyed makeup, and placed her hand on her flat midsection with theatrical care. She announced that she was pregnant. The word hit the room like a thunderclap. Mark froze. The valets' expressions twisted into something complicated, their anger momentarily slammed against the wall of instinctive love for an unborn grandchild. Even Damien blinked. Julia saw Karina's eyes. Not the words, not the pose, but the calculating gleam behind the tears. She saw the empty champagne bottle near Karina's plate, the second bottle half finished, and the empty glass ring where sparkling wine had been. Julia herself had poured those drinks. She walked to the table, lifted the bottle, and turned it in her hand. Vintage Brut, 12% alcohol, expensive and potent. She spoke softly, not to Karina, but to the room, wondering aloud how wise it was for a supposed expectant mother to drink nearly an entire bottle in summer heat. Karina insisted it had been non-alcoholic, a token sip. Victor barked at her to breathe in his face. When she refused, stepping back, the sharp scent of wine in the air betrayed her. The illusion of pregnancy shattered. With nothing left to shield her, Karina crumpled into hysterics, babbling excuses, blaming everyone but herself. Victor spoke the final verdict. He would cut her off permanently. No more transfers, no promises of inheritance, no more safety net. He turned to Mark and laid out a choice. Mark could leave with Karina, stand by her, and accept the consequences. No support, no help, just his junior's salary and the debts he would discover. Or he could walk away, reclaim his life, and try to rebuild whatever might be salvageable with his own integrity. It was Eleanor who offered the cruelest mercy. In a trembling voice, she told Mark that if he stayed with Karina, she would swallow her sorrow but accept it. Yet she begged him not to do it. She asked him to save himself. She spoke of rehab and treatment for her daughter, of sending Karina somewhere far away to confront what she had become. It sounded like an admission that their child had grown into someone they no longer recognized. For once, Mark made a decision without looking at Karina for guidance. He told her he was going to file for divorce. He said he couldn't trust a word she said. The words came out thin and shaky, but they came out, and when he repeated them, they grew stronger. Julia listened, expression controlled, heart pounding. Part of her wanted to cross the room and pull him into an embrace, to remind him that he was still her child. But she held herself still. This was not the moment for softness. Some lessons only mattered if they hurt. She told him she forgave him, but confirmed that the house was gone, to him as well as to Karina and the valets. He would leave with them. The safety of Indigo Point as a fallback option, as a permanent hostel where he could retreat whenever life became uncomfortable, no longer existed. That bridge, she thought, had just been burned. In the end, they left in a rush of slammed doors and shouted accusations. Victor half-dragged Karina to the car as she screamed and threatened lawsuits. Eleanor followed with her purse clutched against her chest like a shield. Mark trailed them, carrying nothing but his jacket and the look of a man seeing his own role in a disaster for the first time. The tires of the valet's car squealed on the gravel as they shot down the drive. Then the sound faded. The house inhaled. For the first time that day, the terrace was silent. Titus raised his glass, the remnants of a stranger's celebration still in it. He toasted Julia, calling her performance one for the ages. He spoke admiringly of the way she had orchestrated revelation and consequence, like a controlled demolition that left the core structure intact. Julia stepped to the railing and looked out at the sea, the water now turning molten under the falling sun. The house behind her had been sold. The people who had treated her like an afterthought were gone. The weight she had carried for years lifted, leaving her oddly light. She had burned her bridges. Now, she had to decide how far she wanted to walk away from the ashes. For a brief hour, it seemed simple. Papers had been signed. Money sat warm and solid in Julia's account, its digits a promise of future choices. Tito Banks, full of swagger and pleased with the role he had played, stood on the terrace like a man already deciding where to put his billiard table. Damien hovered, relieved and exhausted, talking about recording the title and filing the necessary forms in the morning. They poured fresh champagne, not for celebration with guests, but as a private ritual between three conspirators. The bubbles bit Julia's tongue. She felt oddly detached, as though watching herself from the outside. When her phone began to buzz again, she ignored it first. The screen flashed Mark's name, then fell dark, then lit up again. Titus, leaning against the wall, asked if she would answer. She told him no, not yet. Silence. She remarked, might teach her son more than any speech. But the phone rang again and again. On the fourth attempt, she picked it up and set it to the speaker. Mark's voice spilled into the room, shaky and overloud. Traffic noises crowded behind his words, along with the high-pitched echo of someone screaming. He blurted that his mother-in-law had fallen ill at a gas station, that Victor had stopped the car on the highway and ordered Karina out after yet another explosion of insults and demands, that Karina now marched along the shoulder, hurling rocks at passing vehicles, while Eleanor struggled to breathe and begged for water. He asked what to do. Should he go back to his wife? Should he take Eleanor to the hospital? Should he call the police? His questions piled on each other, frantic, as though life were a puzzle only his mother could untangle. Julia listened, then told him firmly to call an ambulance for Eleanor. She reminded him that Karina was a grown woman with a phone and money she had stolen from her parents. Karina would find her own way. He should stay with the people who had been tricked, not the person who had done the tricking. He protested faintly that Karina was his wife. Julia, her patience stripped down to steel, named what Karina had become. Not just a difficult spouse, but someone willing to lie, steal, and manipulate even the idea of a child. If Mark chose her again, she said, he was choosing that kind of life with open eyes. She heard the pause. She heard the breath he took. She heard the moment he decided not to turn the car around. He said he would go with the valets to the police station. Victor wanted to report the fraud. Mark sounded as though he were stepping out of a fog and onto unfamiliar ground. He asked, timidly, if he could come back later, maybe stay with Julia for a while he sorted things out. He confessed that the city apartment he believed they owned was a rental in Karina's name. He had nowhere certain to go. Julia's gaze drifted around the living room. She saw the chairs where the valets had lounged, the plate with half-eaten fish, the abandoned wineglass. She saw the way the evening light poured down the hall she had designed to capture it. The house fell at last, like hers again, clean and quiet. She told Mark no. He reacted as if she had struck him. He asked if she was casting him out. She answered that she was letting him stand on his own. For years, she had been the safety net he didn't know he was using. It had allowed him to avoid hard choices. That safety net was gone. He would pay for his own hotel, find his own job, build his own life. Then, when he had signed divorce papers and drawn up a plan for his future, he could call her. Not before. She ended the call before he could continue pleading. The silence afterward rang, crisp and echoing. Titus, listening to the entire exchange, remarked that refusing her son at that moment showed more strength than selling the house. Julia replied that it showed love, the kind that risked being misunderstood forever for the sake of the child's growth. Damien, ever practical, reminded them that the legal side still needed work. Money had transferred, but the deed transfer could be delayed. Titus mused aloud that he now owned the house, on paper at least. He suggested Julia pack soon and book that flight to some tropical place where no one knew her name. But as he spoke, Julia looked down at the stone under her feet, at the roses brushing the terrace wall, at the way the view had cradled her through lonely nights. She imagined leaving these rooms to a man who would gut them, repaint them, rearrange them until they no longer bore any trace of her life. The thought clenched her chest in a way that had nothing to do with pride of ownership and everything to do with identity. This place was not just an asset. It was the physical proof of her refusal, years ago, to give up after divorce. It was the one thing she had built entirely on her own terms. Could she really walk away from it now, letting the last chapter of its existence be defined by the humiliation that had exploded on its terrace that afternoon? She surprised herself by saying no. Standing at the railing, watching the sky darken, she turned to Titus and told him she wanted to reverse the sale. Damien almost choked. He reminded her that this was not some casual agreement between neighbors. Money had moved. Contracts had been signed. They couldn't simply say never mind. Julia replied that they could if all parties agreed. The bank transfer could be reversed as an error. The contract could be voided by mutual consent. It would be messy and would cost her, but it was possible. She offered to return the full amount immediately, plus a penalty for Titus's trouble. 5%, then at his raised eyebrow, 10. Under his carefully groomed beard, Titus considered her. He studied the way she stood, how her hands curled lightly on the terrace rail, how her jaw clenched but did not tremble. He admitted that most sellers he dealt with had eyes full of relief when signing away a property, not eyes that glinted like someone surrendering a part of their spine. He confessed that he had suspected from the beginning that she was not truly ready to let Indigo Point go. He took the contract from Damien's briefcase, folded it once, twice, then tore it until it was nothing but paper scraps in the ashtray. He told her he'd keep the penalty. Business was business, but he had no interest in snatching a woman's life's work out from under her in a moment of crisis. He had more deals than he knew what to do with. He wanted stories to tell over drinks, not ghosts to haunt him. Relief swept through Julia so strongly her knees almost gave. The money would leave her account as quickly as it had come, plus the penalty, but that felt like a fair price to pay to keep her roots intact. Damien, seeing that his commission remained safe thanks to the penalty, relaxed visibly. He would file the necessary cancellations and adjustments first thing the next morning. As the night deepened, they opened the old brandy Damien had once gifted her and never seen opened. The rich, dark liquid burned its way down Julia's throat and settled warmly in her chest. She stepped out onto the terrace alone later, listening to the waves. Somewhere out in the dark, her son was navigating police reports and hospital corridors. Somewhere, her former daughter-in-law shouted into the wind. Their choices were no longer hers to manage. She checked her phone one more time that night, not for calls from family, but for something else. A travel app notification glowed on the screen, offering discounted flights to Rome. It reminded her of a long-ago promise she'd made herself. To see the churches and piazzas she'd studied in architecture school, to walk streets older than the country she lived in. She had postponed that dream for decades because someone always needed her closer, at hand, available. For the first time in years, no one had that right anymore. She booked a ticket for the next evening. Morning at Indigo Point arrived with a softer light, but the house did not feel gentle. It felt alert, as though it too sensed that something had shifted. Boxes remained unopened. There was no frantic packing, no hurried stripping of shelves. Julia had decided she would not flee from her own rooms like a tenant evicted overnight. She would leave on her own timetable, in her own style. She drank coffee on the terrace with her small suitcase resting near the door, flight confirmation in her email, taxi scheduled. A faint breeze moved through the wisteria, carrying the smell of the sea. The cicadas had not yet begun their daily chorus. For the first time, she could hear the small sounds of the house itself. The fridge motor humming, the ticking of the old clock in the hallway, the creak of the stairs cooling from the night's chill. A sharp knock at the gate interrupted the quiet. Julia expected a neighbor, or perhaps an early visit from Damien with paperwork. Instead, when she reached the gate and peered through the iron bars, she saw a deliveryman struggling with a massive basket of white roses. Behind him leaned a familiar sand-colored SUV with Titus beside it. She opened the gate. The scent of roses surged forward, lush and pure. Nestled among the blooms lay an envelope with her name in careful script. Titus greeted her with exaggerated formality, then waved the deliveryman inside to set the arrangement down. Inside the envelope, instead of another contract, she found a short letter. Titus proposed renting Indigo Point from her for the summer. He offered generous terms and promised that his security staff would keep uninvited visitors far away. He made one odd condition. He wanted permission to send her photos of the roses sometimes, so she could advise him on how to keep them from dying under his neglect. He admitted his skills with flowers were abysmal, He figured an architect who nurtured roses by the sea might know a few tricks. It was, Julia thought, the perfect solution. The house would not sit empty while she walked ancient streets overseas. Her bank account would be bolstered, her roses would be watered, and, most importantly, any thought Mark or Karina might have about simply drifting back later, hoping to reclaim their old privileges, will be met by a wall of formidable security and a signed lease. They drew up a rental agreement at the kitchen table, Titus listening carefully as she outlined the boundaries of what he could and could not alter. No tearing down walls, no upgrades that erased the character of the place. He agreed, joking that he did not dare anger an architect who had already orchestrated a real-life courtroom drama in her living room. When he left, keys temporarily in his pocket, she felt no sting of loss. Indigo Point remained hers. It would simply host a different kind of guest for a while, a guardian disguised as a tenant. Her phone buzzed once more before her taxi arrived. It was a message from Mark. He wrote that they had spent most of the night at the police station, filing reports and presenting documents. He wrote that Karina had been picked up for causing a disturbance on the highway and that, once in custody, her tangled finances had begun to unravel quickly. He confessed that the extent of the debts terrified him. He said Victor intended to pursue charges and cut contact for a time. Mark added that he had booked a room using his own card, that he was looking for additional work, and that he had spoken to a lawyer about divorce. He finished with a plea for forgiveness and a promise to handle it. The tone of the message carried less of the old helplessness and more of something new, uncertain, but real agency. Julia read it twice. Then she typed a short reply. She told him she believed in his ability to manage his life. She repeated that they would see each other in a month, that he should call once the divorce papers were filed and he had a concrete plan. She signed it with love. Then she blocked Karina's number. The taxi pulled up at noon. Titus stood on the terrace, already exploring the house, as though testing out the echo of his voice in different rooms. Julia glanced back at him before getting into the car. He lifted a hand in a casual salute, promising to send photos of the roses and to scare off any unwelcome ghosts. As the car moved down the drive, Indigo Point receded in the rear window. The terraces she had sketched in pencil so long ago, the roofline she had fought over in zoning hearings, the roses that had grown from sticks into a thriving, fragrant screen. It was not an ending, she realized, but a pause. A comma where she had once believed there should be a period. On the highway to the airport, fields and marshes blurred into long strokes of green and gold. Julia leaned her head back against the seat and let the rhythm of the road soothe her. She thought of Rome, of stone streets worn smooth by centuries of footsteps, of cathedrals whose domes she had traced from textbook photographs. She pictured herself walking those streets alone, not as a tourist dragging a reluctant family, but as a woman following a thread of curiosity she had laid aside for decades. Her phone rested silent in her bag. For once, no one demanded she answer immediately. No one expected her to rearrange her life around their last-minute crises. Mark would either rise to meet his new reality or sink under it. That choice belonged to him now. The Valles would face the consequences of their willful blindness. Karina would confront, in one way or another, the wreckage of her lies. As the plane later lifted off the runway and the coastline shrank to a thin line between sky and sea, Julia looked out the window. Somewhere far below, Indigo Point stood on its cliff, buffeted by the same salt wind that had shaped it from the beginning. The house had withstood storms before. It would stand through this chapter too. But she no longer imagined herself as a fixed monument at its center. She had built something solid enough to let go of, even if only for a while. The jet banked and turned east, chasing the sun. For the first time in a very long life, Julia felt that her days belonged entirely to her. No one else held the deed.